Buenas tardes a todos, a todas. Muchas gracias por venir. Preguntas las pueden hacer en castellano, no hay problema para entender. Y después las respuestas, si quieren, las puedo traducir si necesita ayuda. No creo, pero... Bueno, voy a presentar al Dr. Koumjian. Nicholas Koumjian es abogado, graduado de la Universidad de Carolina del Norte, magíster en Administración de Negocios por la Universidad de California y se desempeñó como fiscal durante muchos años en la ciudad de Los Ángeles, en Estados Unidos. En el año 2000 comenzó a trabajar como abogado de la sala de juicio del Tribunal Penal Internacional para la ex Yugoslavia y en 2003 asumió como fiscal adjunto general en los paneles para crímenes graves de Timor Oriental. En 2005 asumió el cargo de fiscal internacional y después asesor jurídico senior en la oficina del fiscal de la sección de crímenes de guerra de la Corte de Bosnia-Herzegovina. Entre 2007 y 2013 se desempeñó como abogado principal de juicio y abogado senior de apelaciones en la oficina de la Fiscalía de la Corte Especial para Sierra Leona y entre 2013 y 2019 trabajó como cofiscal internacional en las salas extraordinarias en las Cortes de Camboya. En 2019 fue designado por el Secretario General de las Naciones Unidas como jefe del Mecanismo Internacional Independiente de Investigación para Myanmar y es en este carácter que está de visita en Argentina, así que muy amablemente se ofreció a venir y a compartir con nosotros la extensísima experiencia que tiene de trabajar en distintas instancias de justicia internacional, como dice el título. La idea entonces es que él haga su presentación en inglés, va a estar acompañada por un PowerPoint para ayudar un poco a la comprensión y después cuando termine la presentación abrimos el espacio para preguntas. So, without further ado, el doctor Koumjian.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Gracias por invitarme acá. Es un gran placer regresar a la UBA porque yo enseñé un curso en el Departamento de Postgraduados sobre juicios orales en el año 94 o 95. Es la primera vez que he regresado. Es un placer. Y voy a empezar un poquito en el castellano cuando me canso o cuando no puedo continuar. Voy a empezar en inglés. ¿Todos hablan inglés acá o no? Quizás, y también me gusta contestar las preguntas que ustedes tienen y puedo hablar de cualquier tema que ustedes tienen. Yo tengo mucha experiencia en los últimos 20 años en diferentes tribunales. Este discurso es más enfocado en el mecanismo para Myanmar, pero yo está bien para contestar preguntas sobre los otros. Quizás puedo dar un poquito resumen de mi carrera. Yo era un fiscal en el condado de Los Ángeles por 20 años. Y después empecé como fiscal en el Tribunal para la ex Yugoslavia. Entonces, por los últimos 22 años, he trabajado en 7 diferentes tribunales criminales internacionales. En realidad ha sido un gran honor, pero también cuando pienso en mi carrera, especialmente en los principios años, yo recuerdo y mis amigos, mis colegas dicen lo mismo. Cuando empezamos en el año 2000, todos pensamos que íbamos a cambiar el mundo, que vamos a obtener justicia a las víctimas, todas las víctimas van a agradecernos, van a ser muy felices con nuestro trabajo. Y hoy en día nosotros tenemos un punto de vista quizás un poquito más maduro. El sistema de derecho internacional penal es débil. Eso es la realidad. La mayoría de los criminales escapan la justicia. Eso es la verdad. Y también, como toda la justicia, hay cosas que no podemos hacer. No podemos cambiar las fronteras, por ejemplo. No podemos recrear la situación que existía antes de la guerra, antes de los crímenes. Pero todavía yo pienso que es muy importante nuestro trabajo, porque y hay una diferencia entre hoy y hace 25 años. que el primer tribunal de derecho Yugoslavia fue creado en el año 92. Antes de eso, yo creo que casi nunca nadie estaba hablando de los crímenes de guerra, crímenes de la lesa humanidad. Pero hoy en día, cuando hay una guerra como en Ucrania, bueno, desde el primer día casi, todos estaban hablando si hay crímenes de guerra, si hay crímenes contra la lesa humanidad. Lo que espero yo y mis colegas que están conmigo, que todos nuestros tres trabajamos para el mecanismo para Myanmar. Y esperamos que nuestro trabajo por lo menos puede reducir un poquito la violencia. Porque quizás las personas que están pensando en hacer los crímenes saben que hay un grupo que está recopilando evidencia de los crímenes. Y quizás ellos algún día pueden estar frente de un tribunal. Y yo recuerdo un militar me dijo que él estaba de acuerdo con eso, porque él ha escuchado durante la guerra soldados hablando, no debemos hacer eso porque vamos a la Haya si lo hacemos. Y también hay otra cosa, yo creo que para las víctimas, ellos quieren a alguien que quiere recibir su testimonio. Para ellos es importante saber que el mundo está mirando lo que pasa, y cares about what is happening and say it's very simple. Entonces, a veces es muy frustrante lo que hacemos. Nosotros vemos crímenes en Myanmar, gente muriendo, mujeres violando todos los días, no hay mucho que nosotros podemos hacer, pero creo que es importante que estamos. Y estamos acá, no sé si alguien sabe, puede adivinar por qué estamos acá en la Argentina. Por razones de trabajo, no de turismo. Porque hay un proceso, quizás pocos argentinos saben eso, hay un proceso en el Tribunal del Distrito Federal de Buenos Aires. Unos 7 querellantes que solicitan una investigación sobre crímenes en Myanmar contra el pueblo rohingya. 6 son mujeres que dicen que fueron violados en Myanmar y ahora están refugiados en Bangladesh. Y estamos acá porque quizás voy a explicar ahora nuestro mecanismo. Próximo, por favor. Primero, en el año, no sé si ustedes saben, I'm switch to English now, I know it's Irish. And I think it's less painful for you. In 2017, in particular, there was a military operation against the Rohingya people, carried out largely by the Myanmar military, which is called the Tatmadaw. So the military, assisted many times by civilians from the western state of Rakhine, and that state is populated about 90% by people who are known as Arakan people or Rakhine people. And there's a small Muslim minority that lives mainly in the north of that state. So it's in the far west of Myanmar, on the border of Bangladesh and the sea. So in 2017, in August 25th, there was a group of these Rohingya people who were Muslim, which was a group with some radical Islamic background, that organized an attack on about 25 police stations. There were a lot of Rohingya participating in the attack, but they were very poorly armed. Many of them only had machetes, very few firearms, and some were armed only with sticks. So there were some casualties among the police and many among the Rohingya. But after that, the army began an operation that resulted in the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya people. So at that time, there was about 1.5 million, talking in very general terms, no one knows exactly, Rohingya in Rakhine State. And in the course of the next several months, because of these operations where the military went into villages, often arrested men, often the men were taken away and later never seen again, or their bodies were found and they'd been killed, many times burning down the village. Out of the approximately 1.5 million Rohingya that were living in Rakhine State, about 900,000 fled the country over the border into Bangladesh. And now, that was August of 2017, now we're approaching almost 5 years. The next slide. 5 years since these people had to flee their homes. Next slide. And now they live in these conditions. They live in refugee camps in Bangladesh. I believe from what I've heard, testimonies that I've seen and read, that probably the Rohingya are the people most persecuted in the world. And it's a big world, and I know there are many, many people persecuted and suffering, but certainly they're one of the most, if not the most persecuted group in the whole world. Even those that remain in Myanmar, and this was true before these clearance operations in 2017, have restrictions on the way they live their life. They're not recognized as citizens of Myanmar because although they were born there, although almost all of them, their parents were born there, although for almost all, their grandparents were born there, the state had the belief that many or most of them had come originally from Bangladesh during the colonial period when Britain ruled Myanmar. And for that reason, they felt that they were not part of the Burmese or Myanmar people. The state recognizes what they say is 135 nationalities as citizens of Myanmar. It's never clear, they never have a clear list of what those 135 nationalities are. But it's clear that they've consistently said the Rohingya people are not recognized as these citizens. They have very complicated laws which purport to offer a very complicated process where a Rohingya can become a type of citizen, but for most people, it's not possible. They live in villages that it's very difficult for them to leave. They have to have a pass to leave their own village. Often it requires paying a bribe that they cannot afford. Even when people are sick, even when women need to give birth, they often cannot get to the hospital 10 or 20 kilometers away, because to do so they would have to pass 3 or 4 or 5 checkpoints, have bribes, or have a pass that takes 2 weeks to get before they could go to the hospital. So now it's approaching 5 years, and they live in conditions as refugees. They don't have regular structures, they live in tents or shacks. Bangladesh welcomed them, took them in. But of course, Bangladesh is one of the poorest countries in the world also, an overpopulated country. Bangladesh does not want to absorb the Rohingya. They want them to return to Myanmar. And the Rohingya people, all those that I've talked to, want to return to Myanmar. But they want to return when it's safe to do so. And for many of them, that means not returning to the place where the person who was responsible for killing their brother or their husband or for throwing their child into a fire is still in charge, still exercising power in that community. So in 2018, the United Nations Human Rights Council is again an aerial view of these camps in Bangladesh. Just go back for a second to that. This used to be all jungle. It was heavily forested, and it was populated mainly by elephants, actually. So sometimes elephants still return to this ground, and they've killed people just charging through these refugee camps when people can't get out of the way. And these are often, most of these are hills. So in the typhoon season, in the heavy rains, there's always the risk that they will be washed away. And in the past couple of years, there's also been a problem with fires. And just a few weeks ago, I think just before I left for Argentina, there was a fire, destroyed, I forget how many, 50 or 100 structures, and then one 6-year-old child was found in the fire, lost its life in the fire. So the Human Rights Council decided to create a mechanism. So what is a mechanism? It's not a court. It's not a police. Why not? Well, partly that's because the experience of the international community with courts, like the ones I've worked at for the former Yugoslavia, the one I worked at in Cambodia and Sierra Leone, are quite expensive. And even those courts, their success depends a lot on the cooperation of the state that has control of the territory where the witnesses are, where the evidence is, where that controls the trials. I think someone won the election. So there wasn't political will to create a court. And something very similar had happened with Syria. Of course, all of you are aware of the horrific conflict in Syria, and there were many calls by many countries for the Security Council to refer the case to the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is, of course, a court that's created by treaty. There's about 120 countries that are members of the court. Its jurisdiction is limited depending on which countries have signed that treaty. And unfortunately, many of the most powerful countries, and also the most populous countries, and the countries that are most likely to be in conflicts, are not willing to risk putting their citizens, their soldiers, their generals, their presidents before an international court or an international prosecutor to decide who to charge. So even on the Security Council, permanent members, the three of the five members of the Security Council are not members of the International Criminal Court. 3 of the 5 permanent 5 members, that is China, the United States, and Russia, are not members of the International Criminal Court. And other of the most populous countries, India, Pakistan, are not members of the court. Most Latin American countries, of course, are members of the court. But countries in the Middle East are not. Saudi Arabia, Syria, Israel, Egypt are not members of the court. Only in the Middle East, really, it's Jordan that is a member of the court. So the court, the International Criminal Court, has jurisdiction when crimes happen on the territory of one of the countries that signed the treaty, or crimes that were committed by the national of one of the countries that signed the treaty. So when you sign the treaty, you're basically saying, the country is saying, we have jurisdiction over crimes on our territory, or we have jurisdiction over crimes by our citizens, including our soldiers, including our president or prime minister, and we agree that the internet, to give that authority to the International Criminal Court. So many countries wrote a letter, I think about 35 countries, to the Security Council asking them to have a court for Syria, but of course that was blocked. I think in that case, there was a veto by Russia and China for referring Syria to the International Criminal Court. And then someone had the idea that, well, if we can't have a court, let's at least create a body to collect the evidence so that that could be shared someday with a court, either international or national. And so a mechanism was established for Syria by the General Assembly with that mandate to collect evidence that it would then share with international courts. And there is none now dealing with Syria, although I believe that recently there was a case filed at the International Court of Justice under the Torture Convention concerning Syria. And then also national authorities. And in the case of Syria, there's actually quite a few national processes, because many fighters either came from, especially West European countries, to Syria to participate, particularly Islamists, joining Islamist groups, participate in the conflict. And also many who were Syrian left the country because of the conflict and settled in Western Europe. So they have the presence of these suspects on their territory, and Western European countries in particular are very concerned about that. So they had a big interest in having a court collect evidence to share with national authorities. And we've seen several prosecutions. There was one, quite famous one, recently in Germany, where a Syrian man who had been imprisoned in a place where people were tortured saw on the street the commander of the prison. And it turns out the commander of the prison had fled Syria and was living in Germany. The German authorities investigated, and they eventually brought him to trial, and he was convicted, I believe, of torture, partly through the help of evidence from the Syrian mechanism. A second mechanism was created by the Security Council with the mandate to collect evidence of crimes by ISIS, by Daesh, the Islamic State. So it's rather unusual in the mandate of a mechanism, but they were given the mandate to only investigate crimes in Syria, in Iraq, by ISIS, and not by any other group. They couldn't, for example, investigate crimes committed by the Iraqi government or any of the international forces, the Americans or anyone else who had assisted and fought in Iraq. So we were the third mechanism, the mechanism for Myanmar to be created. And the mandate that we have is to recopilar, organizar, preservar, analizar evidencia de los crímenes más serios, los crímenes internacionales más serios. ¿Y qué quiere decir con crímenes internacionales? Según una carta del Secretario General al Consejo de Derechos Humanos, que es nuestros términos de referencia, crímenes internacionales son genocidio, crímenes contra la lesa humanidad, crímenes de guerra. Y nosotros también tenemos el mandato para preparar archivos para compartir con procesos internacionales o nacionales para facilitar casos criminales in order to help to hold to account those responsible for crimes. So that is why we are here in Argentina, to talk to the authorities in the court about how we can share evidence that we have collected with the process in Argentina so that the judges have the best facts available. So this is a map of Myanmar. It's a country, of course, in Asia. To its east is Thailand, to the north is Laos and China, and then it also has a long border with India and a small border with Bangladesh. Next. It's a beautiful country. This is one of the main Buddhist temple in Yangon. Next. Next. And it has a long tradition of military rule. So back in, when the country was largely created by military officers, including especially the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Prize winner. He was assassinated just before independence. But the military has dominated politics. And since from 1962 until elections that were held in 2015, there was military rule of the country. In 2015, there were elections where a civilian government took power under a constitution. I'll explain what I mean by took power. It won the election, but it was under a constitution written by the military. And so, for example, it gave the military 25%, 1/4 of the seats in parliament. Any change of the constitution required more than 75%, more than 3/4 of the parliament. So change of the constitution was blocked. It also provided that the civilian government really did not have the power to name the chief of the military. So 3 of the most important ministries, including the Defense Ministry and the Home Affairs Ministry, were the prerogative of the military to name whoever they wanted as the leader. Okay? So we were created, as I mentioned, after these ethnic cleansing operations in Rakhine State. But we really were created a lot because of a report that the Human Rights Council had created a fact-finding mission to write a report about what had happened in Myanmar. And the fact-finding mission, of course, did concentrate on the photograph on the far right, and the state in the far west, Rakhine State, where the Rohingya were. But it also looked into other events, and it found that there was a long history of violations very similar to what happened in Rakhine State, perhaps not on that same scale, but the similar strategies and similar crimes had been committed in other parts of the country in conflicts between the Tatmadaw, the military, and ethnic groups, particularly in the border areas in Las Fronteras. So, next. There are some count about over 100 different armed groups in Myanmar. Myanmar is a country where about 80% are from the main ethnic group, Burman ethnic group. And then there are other minorities, and mainly concentrated in the areas around the borders. I talked about the Syria. I'll come back to this picture in a moment. So the fact-finding mission said, although it's important to investigate what happened in Rakhine State, they encouraged the Human Rights Council in our mandate to give us mandate to cover the entire country. And in fact, our mandate covers all of the territory of Myanmar. It doesn't cover anything that happens outside of Myanmar. So violations of rights of refugees once they leave Myanmar is not within our mandate. And in terms of time, it goes from the year 2011, but is ongoing. So many of you know that in last year, on the 1st of February, the military, despite the fact that it had this constitution that gave them so much power, decided it could no longer tolerate living side by side with the civilian government and overthrew the civilian government. And so the civilian president and Aung San Suu Kyi, who was the leader of the party that won the elections, are in detention. They're in prison, along with many of the other leaders of the civilian government. And there's been a tremendous amount of civilian resistance to the coup, to the golpe d'État. There are groups that have collected evidence of, I think now it's certainly well over 1,500 persons being killed, 5,000 arrested, detained, many instances of torture. When the coup first happened, we said, well, this is not within our mandate. because it doesn't fit the definition of serious international crimes. It's not genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. But we said, knowing the history of Myanmar and the history that it had of political violence, or violence against political protesters, particularly in 1988, where hundreds were machine gunned in the streets of Myanmar and in other places, that we would be watching closely. And we saw in the first weeks after the coup, while there were quite a lot of arrests, the military was not using significant force against demonstrators. It was tolerating protests. But that changed after about a month. And we saw the military using lethal force against protesters. And it changed about the same time in different places, which indicated to us that this was not something that local commanders were doing, but part of a central policy. So based upon that preliminary evidence, we announced that we would be collecting evidence because this appeared to be fit the definition of crimes against humanity, a widespread or systematic attack on the civilian population. We felt it was both widespread, occurring in many places and many crimes, and systematic in that it targeted specific groups, such as doctors and such as journalists, members of the political opposition. So let's go back for a second. As I said, our mandate is to share with national and international courts. We have the one process here in Argentina, and explain to Sharon. There also are two international processes that fortunately we're able to cooperate with. So the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor a few years ago in that court had the idea to ask the judges whether they could investigate what happened to the Rohingya in Myanmar. Now, remember I told you that how the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court worked, and it's restricted to the territory of states that signed the treaty. There's an exception to that if the Security Council refers a case to the International Criminal Court. It's done that for Libya, which was not a member of the court, and it did that for the Darfur region of Sudan. But you weren't going to get a referral from the Security Council to the ICC because China particularly has been and Russia have been big supporters of the military regime. And Russia and China, especially Russia, has done a lot of military sales to Myanmar. But the prosecutor of the International Court said, okay, these crimes started in Myanmar, but the people then went across the border to Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a signatory to the International Criminal Court. And one of the crimes within the statute of the International Criminal Court is the forced displacement or deportation of persons. And that's when people are forced to move within a country or across the borders of the country to another country. So they said, well, this crime then was not complete. The crime was ongoing when they stepped over the border in Bangladesh. You couldn't have a deportation across the border until they stepped across the border. The judges in the pretrial chamber accepted that logic, and they instructed the prosecutor that he could investigate all the crimes that happened where people were deported across the border to Bangladesh, and any crimes that were related, that motivated that displacement of persons across the border. So we have that ongoing process, and it's one that we're cooperating with and sharing evidence with. Then there was a lawsuit filed here. This is the International Court of Justice, also in The Hague. So this reminds me when I got the interview for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I was so excited, and I went to The Hague, and I dressed up in my suit in my hotel, and I asked them where the court was, and I wanted to get there a little bit early, not too early. And I went to the front gate here, And they kept looking for my name. You don't have an appointment. You don't have an appointment. Finally, I realized they realized I'm in the wrong place. So it was summertime. I remember running a couple miles to the other court, arriving late, soaking with sweat, and ended up okay. So this beautiful building is the International Court of Justice. It's not a criminal tribunal. It has the mandate to hear disputes between states in certain circumstances. And usually what gives them jurisdiction is that states, countries sign treaties that say, in the treaty, if there is a dispute, we all agree that the dispute will go to the judges at the International Court of Justice. It's a branch of the United Nations. The Gambia, which is a tiny, tiny country in Africa, on behalf of the group of Islamic states, filed a petition in the court saying that Myanmar had violated a treaty that both had signed, and that was the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. Gambia said that what happened to the Rohingya is genocide, and what's happening now to the Rohingya, they say, is an ongoing genocide. So asked the court to take certain measures to require Myanmar to address the genocide, to stop it, and to punish those responsible, which is part of the treaty, is that all states that signed the treaty agreed to punish those who were responsible for genocide. That case is ongoing, and they've just reached a stage where now the judges are deliberating on whether or not Myanmar's objections to the court having jurisdiction are valid or not. Myanmar makes certain objections, such as saying, well, Gambia has nothing to do with this. They're not the Rohingya, they don't represent them, they're a country in Africa, they're acting on behalf of a group of states. Frankly, I don't think their arguments are very strong, but the judges are considering that, and will expect, at least by the end of the year, if not much sooner, a decision, and the case would then move on to the fact-finding phase. But the first thing that happens when cases are filed at the International Court of Justice is that often the country filing the petition will ask the court to impose certain measures to be in place while the case is being decided, so that the situation doesn't get worse. Because these cases can take a long time. The case of Bosnia filed a case against Serbia at the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention that took 15 years to be resolved. 15 years before there was a judgment. I suspect that they're going to move faster on this case. But when the Gambia filed the case, they again asked for certain measures from Myanmar, such as preserving the evidence. They also asked that Myanmar be ordered to cooperate with us with efforts to collect evidence of these crimes, international bodies that are collecting evidence. And at that hearing, Myanmar was represented then by their leader. She had a position, it's a long and complicated story, but Aung San Suu Kyi was the head of the civilian government, but she had to take a title other than prime minister or president, because the Constitution had said anyone who had children who were not citizens, and her children were citizens of the United Kingdom, they could not be prime minister or president. But she was in control of the civilian government. And she decided to come and defend Myanmar and the allegations that the military had committed these crimes. And so just to get a little sense of that, we can play her part of her speech at the court. You have audio? Or maybe we can.
Sorry.
No problem. But basically, what she said, it was the similar defense often heard in international criminal cases. that you know, in wars, sometimes some things happen. She said, some crimes happen and we're looking into it, we're going to investigate it. There have been, there was one criminal proceeding, in fact, in Myanmar, I think already at that time, where some journalists had gone to Rakhine State and they had interviewed a lot of people from the village and discovered evidence of a massacre of a group of Rohingya who had been captured during those clearance operations, and had photographs of them alive being marched to a forest, and then photographs of their bodies after being executed. And in that case, the military did prosecute and convict, I believe it was 4 soldiers. It also arrested the journalists, claimed that they had received confidential information. And it turned out that the soldiers, after less than a year, were amnestied by the head of the military, and the journalists spent more time in prison than the soldiers, the journalists that were discovered. I think I've talked about the International Criminal Court. It has a similar jurisdiction to us, but it also has jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, although that's quite restricted. And at the moment, it only has jurisdiction over the crime of aggression if a country that has signed the treaty and said that they agree that the court can have jurisdiction over them for the crime of aggression. So, for example, allegations in the current conflict in Eastern Europe, it would be possible to charge the crime of aggression with the International Criminal Court. So, actually, we have in the audience here Tomas Quintana. Thank you, Tomas. He filed the case that I mentioned on behalf of Rohingya here in Buenos Aires. And Tomas used to be, he was the former special rapporteur for human rights in Myanmar. These are some of the demonstrations against the coup that had taken place. We can play this little video. Let me first give a little caution that there's violence in this. It's not bloody, no one dies, but it shows some of the harsh treatment of protesters that the military started meeting out. These are a group of medics that were at the protests to give medical care to protesters. So I just wanted to end my brief talk with a little bit of optimism. Before I began working for the Mechanism, I spent 6 years in the tribunal for Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. And the pictures on the left are pictures of Pol Pot on the right of that picture, who was the famous leader of Khmer Rouge. In the middle is his number 2, Nun Chea. And to the left was the head of state at the time for the Khmer Rouge, Khi Samphan. Pol Pot died before our court was created, but the other 2 were put on trial. Even though in 2019, just before I went to the Mechanism, we had the full reasoned trial judgment released in March of 2019 about the crimes that were committed by the Khmer Rouge, where in 4 years and 8 months and 20 days, they killed over 2 million people, 25% of the population of that country. Everyone in that country suffered. So the conviction was in 2019, 40 years after the crimes. But it's still, I think, very important for history, and of course for anyone over 40 years old, in Cambodia, they experienced those crimes. So I think it's very important that these people were eventually brought to justice. And we just are coming back from a visit to the Escuela, in the torture center here in Buenos Aires, and we saw that many of the cases continue today, many, many years after the crimes. I think it's still important to victims, important to also to people, especially young people, understanding the history of their own country and what happened. And I think giving people a sense that they, hopefully, that now we live in a society where there is a possibility of some justice. It's a crime without justice is a wound that can't really heal. And another example is Charles Taylor, who was the leader of Liberia and really sponsored rebels in Sierra Leone that carried out a horrific campaign of mass killings and cutting off the hands, famous tactic of cutting off the hands of victims just to terrorize the population. And it took 10 years, but he was brought to justice and eventually sentenced. Trial I had the privilege to participate in to 50 years in prison. The Cambodians, by the way, each got life. They were already in their 80s, one was 90, but they were receiving life sentences. So we do our work for these people, the kids of Myanmar, so that they can live in a better society. So please, I hope there's some questions.
Está abierto para preguntas. A ver quién se anima.
I suppose that this is lots of information, like the mechanism, like I suppose that you get a lot. How do you deal with that? I mean, how do you process it all?
For being the first, for breaking the silence. Well, it's something we're working on every day. But we have many challenges because of not being able to enter Myanmar. And we're still working on also getting the permission of other states all around the world to operate on their territory. It's not so simple. We can't just show up and start doing criminal interviews in a country without the permission of the country involved. So we do, part of our tactic is to interview those who have first-hand knowledge, to take very high quality, to the highest standards, detailed interviews, signed statements from them. But we're also trying to compensate for our lack of access by being innovative in how we collect evidence. So for example, in using modern technologies, we are conducting analysis of satellite photographs to see what happened to a village before it was attacked and how it looked in the satellite after it was attacked. We have also a great amount of evidence we've collected from sources that I can't disclose, and one of the things I can talk about, because it is public record, is we're also looked at collecting evidence from social media. Normally we don't, as I said, we don't say who's sharing evidence with us, but sometimes they want it to be public, and we will say so. Facebook has shared some evidence with us, not all that we've asked for, but the quantity is actually huge. It's millions of pages. Not all of that, of course, is relevant. So one of the things that's different about working now in Myanmar on the mechanism from these other courts I worked at, where the crimes happened 20 years ago, usually, or 40 years ago, is that the technologies have changed. And so that even in a poor country like Myanmar, you also had these villagers, someone had a phone and was recording what happened. So we have thousands, a couple thousand videos, and then we're going through a very time-consuming process of analyzing those videos, especially there are issues because of language, of course, too. Most Rakhine State, in Myanmar, there's about 130 languages spoken, but even the main languages, it's not a common language like Spanish or Arabic. There's only a limited number of people that speak the language, and we have to be very sure that anyone we hire, that we're sure that they're going to preserve the confidentiality of our work. So we have a lot of means of collecting evidence. A lot of NGOs that have already collected evidence have shared it with us. That, I think, it at least helps us directly get directions for the investigation. So what my IT people told me, and I've come to value the IT section of my mechanism. I didn't realize really how important it was going to be when we started. But they say that we now have about 12 million items of evidence collected. 12 million. Again, that number doesn't mean much because sometimes we're talking about huge databases, and then the relevant evidence in the databases might be small, but there are also things that you have to keep it all because you never know what you may find later is very relevant. So we're using, it's an evolution of modern investigation.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. I have two questions. The first one is quite technical, I believe, to the situation in Myanmar, which is, you mentioned the constitution and this quota that it established in order to secure certain military influence in the decision-making process internally. So I was wondering if you have an opinion or an idea on what can be done at the international sphere and the international mechanisms during the processes of drafting those constitutions. I understand that also in the case of Kosovo, they have a constitution which secures a certain quota for the third minority, for instance, which I believe it works in a similar way as to secure certain decisions being carried out in Parliament. So I was wondering if there's any influence that the mechanisms at the international sphere could have during those processes, which at the end of the day translate to the day-to-day reality of minorities there. And my second question is regarding, you mentioned that your objective is to reduce the violence and to, not to create a utopic scenario, but to reduce the violence being suffered. And I was wondering, pragmatically, if you believe that international criminal law in itself is the best way to reduce that violence, or if other mechanisms such as international human rights law, for instance, and their own tribunals, for instance, would be more effective with regards to the day-to-day life of those minorities.
Thank you for the questions. So I definitely think that mechanisms or international criminal law serves a purpose. I hope and believe it deters crimes, but certainly it's not the only method that we should be looking at to prevent crimes. So the human rights reporting is very important, like the fact-finding mission that led to our creation. And it's important to see that those kinds of bodies can act much quicker than us. They're basically giving an opinion, and the standard, it's kind of a worldwide standard for that kind of fact-finding is a reasonable basis. While as all of you law students know, in criminal law, it's a higher standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. So those are important. I mean, your question about whether we can influence issues about sort of constitution drafting, I would say that is not for a criminal mechanism like us to do. There are others in the international community that have that mandate. So, for example, for Myanmar, while there is our mechanism, which is to collect evidence and build criminal files, there also still is a special rapporteur for human rights, whose job is to report on human rights and to make recommendations about things like what the international community can do. He's made some very strong recommendations, for example, about halting arms sales to Myanmar. But it's not really for us to do that. And we try to be very strict. I think it frustrates sometimes victims and other groups. But I do believe it's very important in criminal, when you're doing a criminal investigation, that you leave all of the politics and other matters they don't play a role in what you're doing, that they can confuse things. You know, when a criminal investigation starts with the prosecutor or the investigator saying, this is what happened, and that's a problem. People, the defense will later say at trial, this is an investigation that was determined before it even began. So we try to be very careful in our language and what we talk. It's important to communicate to victims what we're doing and for others to understand it. But it's also important that we maintain our objectivity and be very professional as criminal investigators, I think, and careful in what we say. Because what we hope is to eventually, the evidence we collect is presented in court, and the defendant defends himself in court. We don't try them in the press, we want them in a court and have it to account if they're guilty.
Thank you for being here. I also have two questions. The first one would be, you mentioned Facebook operating in private evidence. There are some things that Facebook has had a role in the genocide. Facebook and other social media. Either by not doing anything or not doing enough to prevent it, to prevent the dissemination of hateful ideas, or maybe even promoting it in order to increase engagement for whatever reason. What is your opinion about that? And also, what is the degree, if any, you think the civilian government has in regards to all the situation that happened in the Rohingya?
Sorry?
The second question would be, what would be the degree of responsibility of the civilian government, if any, regarding Rohingya?
Thank you for asking very, very tough questions that really I cannot answer in public forum. So, when you're asking me about like who's responsible for the crimes, that's something that we're investigating, and we're not prepared now to make any pronouncements about it, if you understand that. And similarly with your first question, it's a very similar answer. There have been, the fact-finding mission found, and many others, that in Myanmar in particular, there was a very strong role of social media. People bought a phone in Myanmar, it came with Facebook installed. And many people never learned to email, they didn't have email accounts, they only sent messages on Facebook. They didn't buy newspapers, they looked at their newspapers. So for that reason, many people felt it has a huge impact on Myanmar, on the crime. So that's something that we're looking into.
I also have two questions. First, to the extent that you're willing to disclose, but if I did not get it wrong, so one of the activities that within your mandate is to get close to national authorities which have ongoing investigations regarding people who may have committed crimes in Myanmar. So that's one of my questions. What does the mechanism do within those processes? And the second question, more on a personal note, it's at the moment where the international tribunals were beginning, like, what were the personal motivations, you said a few, to engage in international criminal law? Because I tried to go back within the years and try to understand what were going through your mind to engage in that kind of criminal investigation.
Thank you. Now I have the second question in mind. I forgot this question. It's about
the connection between the mechanism and the national court.
Our mandate is to share evidence with national proceedings. Someday I would hope that that would be with proceedings in Myanmar. If we were confident, we're only to share information if we're confident it's a fair proceeding. It's not just a show, and that the rights of the accused will be respected. Also, because it's from the United Nations, we have a limitation that we cannot share evidence if the death penalty could be imposed. But In the case of Myanmar, there is the possibility, just as happened in the Syrian mechanism, that other countries around the world could exercise jurisdiction. Perhaps a perpetrator is living in their country, and they say, okay, they could ask us, do we have any evidence that this person committed a crime? And then we would share that evidence with them. And then you have a few countries that have more true universal jurisdiction, such as Argentina, which I understand from others, you guys probably know better than me, it's based on the Constitution, that the Constitution guarantees that there should be no immunity for these very serious crimes, so that on that basis, Argentine courts, in the case of the petition now before the district court, the appeal chamber said, we have to investigate it because it is allegedly a crime against humanity. So Argentine courts have the obligation to hear this petition and to investigate it. As for my motivations, well, I mean, I was a prosecutor for 20 years, and I enjoyed work, particularly in the courtroom. And I also always liked international affairs and international travel. I had briefly been in the diplomatic service, that's why I was here in Argentina. So, for me, the chance to work in those cases at the former Yugoslavia was, it was really interesting. And I definitely had never worked as hard as I did there. And I was very fortunate that I was given and put in charge of what people thought at the time was a small case, but it was really a town where 3,000 people were killed in 100 days in that town. It's quite one of the most nameless towns for the crimes in the former, in Bosnia, creado. And it was very rewarding. The witnesses that came into court, some of their stories were just so impactful. They're incredible survivors, people who've been, one man, for example, he had been pushed over, he was on a bus where they packed about 200 people in one bus, men. Men were coming from a camp that had been released from this camp, and there were about 20 buses, and it was going from the Serbian area to the area controlled by the Bosnian army. But just before it crossed the line, they stopped the buses and they took all the young men and they packed them onto this one bus. They took them to a cliff, they ordered them out, and they lined them up, and they machine gunned these 200, almost 200 men. This one young man, the last thing he felt was his father pushed him over the cliff, and he survived. He lost his foot in the ball off the cliff. But crawling around for 3 days before he was saved. He was saved by Serb soldiers. These were people who saved the life of one of their enemies. So it was tremendously impactful crimes. And like I said, we really thought we were doing some good. And I still think that, although I'm a little bit more jaded about it. And I realize the frustrations of what we did. But it really was very exciting and interesting and very, very rewarding to work on, and particularly to work with victims, to have the top, you get an emotional tie to them. I found working in Cambodia was wonderful, and of course this is a huge crime, the murder of about 2 million people in Cambodia. But the system in Cambodia was that you were not allowed, like in many courts, to talk to the witness before they testified. That was considered interfering with their testimony. So you would have a statement that might have been taken 5 or 10 years ago, and the person was on the stand. It still was very interesting to do. But in the case of the court for the former Yugoslavia, they used more of the American system where you could, witness prep, but really it was lawyer prep. You have to really understand the story, and you would learn so much more, but you also would start to get a real, often emotional tie with the witness, and it's very rewarding. Another witness I had, just to tell a little different, was in the trial of Charles Taylor. We had many of the witnesses who were part of the rebels And many of them freely admitted committing crimes. I remember one very nice gentleman, very soft-spoken and polite, but he was one of the rebels' top generals. And at one point he was talking about how they took this town, and I said, did they, witness victims and said they burned the village? Yes, we burned the houses. We burned the houses in the village. I said, did you hear people scream? Oh yeah, we heard people scream and stuff. Another one was a man who was 4 or 5 different, at least 5 witnesses, including two from the defense and at least 3 from the prosecution, had talked about this one witness that I called having seen him eating human beings. He was a cannibal, and he testified in court about how the defense asked him, and he explained how he would cook a human liver. That was part of his testimony. So it was certainly not an average day in court. Interesting work. And there's always, though, the challenge for these cases, which is a little different from your average domestic case. It's not to prove that the crime happened. That usually the victim's testimony, when you hear someone who's been through this, the judges are not going to have any doubt this really happened. I remember one defense attorney saying to me, you're in the court day after day, it's so obvious these people are telling the truth. My clients are saying they're lying, but it's so obvious that these crimes really happened. But the challenge is usually we didn't spend our time, we had, it's so expensive to try people there, a limited number you could try. So you tried to try those who had a higher level of responsibility. And someone like Charles Taylor, who was convicted of crimes in Sierra Leone, he never set foot in that country. He had no proof he'd ever been in the country. So when he was convicted of crimes where a woman was raped in a village, he had never met the woman. He had never met the guy that raped her. He never gave an order to that rebel from another country who raped her. So the challenge was showing, well, what role did he have in the crimes? Well, we showed how he had helped create that rebel army, how he had supplied them with weapons in return for diamonds, how he had given them instructions and how they generally followed his orders. And he knew about the fact that they were using these terror tactics, and he encouraged them. So that's always the challenge, is making that link and showing the responsibility of leaders. You usually don't have a written order. Why is this leader responsible? In the case of Myanmar and all these villages that were attacked, who was responsible for all those villages being attacked, and what can we show about how that happened?
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Ay, todavía.
Some of these were really, really horrible situations, but it's definitely true that to create a court, and a court, especially a court that has power, it requires political will. And it's not always going to be possible, because often there's going to be a powerful country that doesn't want to agree to have foreign judges decide on the responsibility of the people for that conflict. So I think I'm certain there are very serious conflicts that have not gotten a court, not gotten the attention that others have received. In regards to your first question about
outreach to victims?
Outreach, yes. That's a great question. I really thank you for asking that. We think that that's very important. So one of the things we've tried to do is change our budget to build an outreach section. And we try to reach out to victims, one, by going to Cox's Bazar and meeting with at least their representatives or leaders. But also we have a web page, www.iimm.un.org. We have a Facebook page also, because we know that people in Myanmar use Facebook. And we try to do a lot of interviews and outreach activities to try to meet, especially to meet with the leaders of different communities. So I think it's very, very critical that people know about us. It's important that the victims know about us and that people care and that we're collecting evidence. And they do. We see people are contacting us to share evidence. I also think it's important, of course, that the perpetrators, that people who might be thinking of committing crimes, also know about us. And I have good reason to believe they do. Soon after the coup, at one press conference of the military spokesperson was asked about our mechanism. And he said, oh, they're just putting a lot of pressure on us, a lot of pressure. So I thought that was good.
Yes, sorry. You previously said that the NGOs are covering this mechanism. This sometimes sounds naive, but if we consider that in order to make refugees from the Rohingya people come back to Myanmar, there is a need to build up a new society, our society must protect and accept them as citizens of Myanmar. Besides the NGOs, is there another organization cooperating with you or the United Nations in order to finish it with these atrocities?
Well, there are quite a lot of NGOs working with the refugees, but there are not a lot working inside Myanmar in Rakhine State. Rakhine State has always been an area that the government didn't let many foreigners in. Very, very few, even humanitarian agencies have access. A few have access, and they've often had trouble where if they reported crimes, they got kicked out of the country. So we don't have cooperation with people inside Rakhine State. There are some government supporting efforts to build huts, supposedly for Rohingya, that may eventually return. I think the government of Japan and China and India have given some money for that. But there's not a lot, I don't know if NGOs are working on the issue of particularly the building the relations between the community that's in Rakhine State, which is mainly Rakhine people. They're not part of the main Burmese ethnicity, and the Rohingya.
If I may, I would like to ask you a question, not as head of the mechanism, but as a lawyer with a lot of experience with international tribunals. So let's take, for the sake of an argument, that the ICJ decides to take the argument of Myanmar during the oral hearings, where they say that they're actually in an armed conflict with rebels and they are investigating particularly war crimes or crimes against humanity, and they are taking their obligation of investigating those crimes. Do you think, from the perspective of the relationship between the ICJ and other tribunals, if the ICJ decides to dismiss the case of genocide or decides to dismiss the case on any jurisdictional issue, do you think that that could jeopardize any proceedings in international criminal law by national tribunals or by the ICC?
I think if there's a decision, which is, I think is not that the court decides it does not have jurisdiction, then it wouldn't have any bearing on any case except cases before the International Court of Justice. It would have, in fact, future cases there if it was on a legal point, but I don't see it having an effect in other tribunals.
If I may request, I'm not asking the question from a legal perspective. I'm asking the question more from a political or the influence that the ICJ might have. As you remember what happened with the former Yugoslavia, the appreciation that the ICJ had on the situation of genocide in Bosnia and what happened with the ICTY and other tribunals regarding what happened in the former Yugoslavia. Would that have an influence on the trust that the international community or even the civil society has in international law in general, or do you think it's not something that is going to have an influence?
Certainly for the victims, it'll have an impact in those interested in the case. There's no question that the decisions in this case, in other cases, but this case, for example, is about the definition of genocide. There are important issues, I think, that will have an effect where other courts will look at the decision of this court and how it defines genocide and see, well, they will apply it. So when we had cases in Cambodia, the Cambodian courts would look at the decisions of the International Court of Justice in the case on Bosnia, for example, and follow that logic that they believe was the logic of the International Court of Justice. Which, by the way, I think on the issue of genocide, I think I disagree with some of the decisions that they have because they have said that genocide requires the biological destruction of the group. I don't think the words of the statute support that. I think you can destroy a group without biologically destroying it. The genocide statute says destroy a national, racial, religious, or ethnic group as such. So, for example, if you take a religious group and you say to people, convert or you'll be killed, and people convert, or maybe a couple of them are killed, they're not biologically, the group is not biologically destroyed, but the people do not practice the religion, it no longer exists. So, in my view, and there was one judge at ICTY that said similar things, Judge Abney. You can destroy a group as such without biologically destroying them, which is why of the actus reus of genocide, there's 5, only in one of them, creating conditions of life, it says to destroy the group, to biologically destroy the group. I forget the exact words. Well, why would you put that in only one of the 5 if it applied to all 5? So it doesn't make any sense to me that the interpretation of the International Court of Justice. I don't know if the parties are going to challenge that in this case. So they still have, and they still argue, I believe, that even getting that definition is genocide. So that the decision will have tremendous effect legally, and yeah, definitely politically it will have an effect. But the political effect will depend on if it has, what happens if they find, for example, there is genocide. Then what happens? What's the remedy? In the case of Bosnia versus Serbia, on the facts, the International Court of Justice, which doesn't really have a lot of mechanisms to take facts. You know, trials at the International Court of Yugoslavia would often take years. Hundreds of witnesses may testify in a trial, and at least dozens, sometimes hundreds. The International Court of Justice pretty much just adopted the findings from the ICTY, from the Yugoslav Tribunal, which was mainly the finding that there had been genocide in the town of Srebrenica, and said that, and they found that Serbia had failed in its duty to punish the perpetrators and to prevent that from happening, because Yugoslavia at the time, and Milosevic had influence, they said, that they could have prevented it from happening. But for whatever reasons I don't really understand, they said a remedy would be appropriate. They said they found it, but they ordered no remedy.
I'm sorry, last question. Do you have any protection against security when you are here? Because I think that maybe you can get something. I hope not, of course. Do you have someone there protecting you?
Well, if I did what I tell you, I don't hear, but I mean, we do have, we take security, particularly security of our information. It's very important to us. We has to approve all of my trips and make sure that they're secure. But our mechanism in particular, we're very concerned with the security of our staff. my face is public, but we try not to, those that are going to be going to the field and interviewing people in the field, we try not to make them so well known to those that may wish ill for our mechanism.
I'd like to ask you, what was your experience in the East Timor Tribunal and in the panels that's named? It's different than the court of Australia and Rwanda. Can you explain us the difference between them in practical terms?
Sure. Well, I was the head international prosecutor, so we had, what happened in East Timor, for those who are not aware of it, Timor-Leste, Timor-Oriental, is time of the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia was in a crisis. They had seized the territory of East Timor back in 1972, I believe, and it had always previously been a Portuguese colony. They had an election, they agreed, because of the financial crisis and all the pressure, to have a referendum on independence. And in the referendum, the people of East Timor voted overwhelmingly to be independent. But the military did not really accept that, and they were working with local militias, and they ended up burning down about 75% of the structures in East Timor. About 1,000 plus people were killed. And then eventually the Indonesians withdrew, and the United Nations governed the country for 2 years because it was a very poor country. It had no experience in governing itself. For example, there were people who had been to law school, but there was no one in the country who had been a judge or a prosecutor or defense attorney. So they also set up, during the UN administration, these panels, special panels for serious crimes, with a mandate to hear crimes against humanity and other serious crimes. And so I was appointed at one point as the international deputy general prosecutor for serious crimes in charge of that unit. And we actually tried quite a lot of people compared to the other tribunals. Something like 60, I forget, 70 people were tried, but they were very small cases. They were individual perpetrators. And the militia leaders and, of course, the Indonesian military were outside the territory, and they did not, there was no way to arrest them. We ended up sometimes taking their arrest warrants to Interpol, and there were red notices for them, but they never got arrested. Sometimes it still had the effect that, for example, an Indonesian soldier might be prevented from going to training in the United States. The United States would not accept him for training because he had an arrest warrant for serious crimes. But when I was there, already, before I had gotten there, had been a request by the prosecutor, my predecessor, for an arrest warrant against the top commander of the armed forces, Wiranto. And when I was there, he was running for president. He was on behalf of the largest party. But at that, and we were able to convince the judge to issue the arrest warrant. So in the middle of the Indonesian election, it came out that there was an international arrest warrant for this presidential candidate. He didn't get arrested, and I think it was quite a moment, quite important for Indonesia. I don't know if I answered your question.
Can I ask a question? I don't know. Can I ask a
Professor,
No, I have just maybe two questions, very technical. One is related to the procedural rules on evidence collection. Whether, because I don't know if you follow certain rules of evidence collection and whether that may limit the value that the evidence might have before a national court and have different procedural rules on evidence. That's one question. How do you do it? Because it's like a universal procedural rule on evidence collection. And the other one, what type of analysis you do with the evidence? Whether you do legal in the sense of maybe qualifying the actions, whether it's, I don't know, this is a crime against humanity or war crime, or what is the legal analysis of the extent of the legal analysis that you do regarding the evidence?
Thanks. Good questions. As far as like what the standards are, we're working on those. I mean, we do have written some standards, but we've identified a real issue because we're supposed to share these with courts that could be international, they could be common law, they could be civil law. Every country has its own regulations. So we're trying to use procedures that will make our products relevant. But a good example is the issue of when a witness, when we take a statement, what do they declare or what type of oath do they sign? And so, we ourselves, normally in many countries you say, I don't understand if I'm telling a lie, I'll go to prison for up to 3 years. But we're not police, we're not a court. We can't really say that normally. We are thinking about whether we can use that in individual countries when we're working with the local authorities. But what we decided to do for the oath is, we looked at the oath that the International Court of Justice administers to witnesses who testify, because we definitely want our statements to be useful there. And so we asked the witnesses to use the same declaration, which is simply they have the witnesses declare that what I'm saying, to the best of my knowledge and belief, is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but true. So we use the exact words. But it's something that I'm sure will continue to evolve. And it's one of the things that we discuss with those that we're potentially sharing with, including the authorities here. How can we make our product relevant and useful to you because of the different procedures in different countries? And as far as how we analyze it, again, we still feel that, it sounds like we've been working a while, 2 years, but the crimes are so huge and the complications are such that we still feel we're very much at the beginning. But we'll analyze things both in qualifying what crimes happen in a particular location, for example. But also some things that we work on is for international crimes. They generally require certain what are called chapeau elements. In other words, every crime against humanity has to be shown to have taken place in the context of a widespread or systematic attack on the civilian population. So, for different, we want to analyze that and analyze it both legally and factually. So, to say that there was a widespread and systematic attack in Rakhine State, the civilian population would probably be the Rohingya in that context. But there also is another war between the Arakan army and the Burmese army. Is that a crime against humanity? Is that a widespread and systematic? There are other conflicts around the country, many related to the post-coup resistance. Do those qualify? So it's complex, and armed conflicts require also that you show that there is an organized force that's engaged in the conflict, and generally that they hold territory and can control their troops. Well, there are so many different conflicts in Myanmar, it's quite complicated. So one of the things that we hope to produce as a product to share with prosecutors in national and international courts is analysis of these chapeau elements.
¿Hay alguna pregunta más? ¿Alguien se quedó con las ganas de preguntar?
Muchas gracias a ustedes por la invitación.
Gracias, muchas gracias.